Hello there, this is the video for the 5.13 lesson, preparing for the unit test. So it's our last lesson before the unit 5 test. Okay, so as always, you have online and offline review activities. Some of the online review activities are 3 listed here: culture and counterculture, tragedies 2 centuries apart, and stagflation, economic crisis of the 70s. Those 3 you've done in prior lessons, so I'm not going to go through them now, but we will go through Beat the Clock Unit 5 review. And essentially there's going to be questions and we have to pick through the multiple choice answers to pick the best one. And there's going to be a clock ticking in the background. Don't let that make you nervous. I'm not going to rush through it. We just want to try to get them right. All the following describe Richard Nixon's foreign and domestic policy achievements as president, except for ending the Vietnam War, establishing diplomatic relations with China, affirmative action, EPA and the Family Assistance Program, and détente with the Soviet Union. Okay, these foreign and domestic achievements as president. All of these, let's see, not that. Okay, let's replay that again. I want to make sure I get the right answer. What author and book brought to light women's unhappiness with their roles and initiated the second wave of the women's movement? That's going to be Betty Friedan and the Feminine Mystique. Answer D. Which of the following was one of several events that led to the Cuban Missile Crisis? And that is A. Soviet military advisors were helping Cuba build missile sites. Protest riots in the presence of National Guard troops characterized what 1960s event? That is going to be the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Answer is D. True equality for women would have been seen on a sign held by demonstrators for which of the following groups? That's going to be A, the National Organization of Women, otherwise called NOW. In the early 60s, large numbers of people fled East Berlin, causing an economic crisis for the East Germans. What did this result in? That was the Berlin Wall. B, the construction of a wall separating East and West Berlin. Which word best describes the economic condition of the 70s? That's going to be stagflation. A. The economic crisis of the 1970s has roots in which of the following events? That's going to be C, the Yom Kippur War between Egypt and Israel, because that's going to set off events in the Middle East that's going to lead to the oil embargo, which is going to lead to the economic crisis. Which of these is a legacy of the Vietnam War? The United States won the respect of many nations. No, they did not. B, Vietnam was divided into 2 sections, one communist and one democratic. No, they both became communist. C, American citizens continued to distrust government actions in the United States. Yes. Or D, patriotic pride increased for persevering in a difficult war. That was not it, so it's going to be C. The surprise New Year's Day attacks by the North Vietnamese were referred to as the Tet Offensive. The Tet was the Vietnamese New Year. Activists achieved all the following during the second wave of feminism, except the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. It was not ratified by a needed number of states. Training and supplying the South Vietnamese to take over full responsibility for the war was a strategy of Richard Nixon. That was Vietnamization. Berlin Wall, Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, Gulf of Tonkin. Those are all key events of the Cold War. What provided the most hope to women, Native Americans, Hispanics, and gays and lesbians seeking equal protection under the law during the 60s and 70s? And that's going to be B, the success of African Americans in their struggle for civil rights. How was the Cuban Missile Crisis resolved? With negotiations that removed Soviet missiles from Cuba and U.S. missiles from Turkey. That is the correct one. The concept of executive privilege in the Watergate scandal, investigation, and subsequent court cases was not something the Constitution addressed. A. The belief that communism would spread in Southeast Asia led to, it was not a wall. For A. B, U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia, yes. C, they did not attempt to overthrow the Chinese government. And the United Nations dividing Vietnam. So we're going to say B. What best describes one lasting effect of the Watergate scandal? And it's going to be D. Many Americans became cynical about politics and lost faith in their government. What was the most significant aspect of détente? The risk of nuclear war between the two superpowers was reduced. Go to college, get a good job, and work 9 to 5, have a family, climb the corporate ladder. These values just aren't for me. Who could have likely said this? We know that's going to be a college dropout living in a commune in the late 60s. That's going to be like a counterculture. Which of the following does not correctly identify a person with the role he played during the Vietnam War? And the one that's not correct is Lyndon Johnson. He was not President Nixon's Secretary of State. Lyndon Johnson was president. Which leader used nonviolent techniques to advocate on behalf of California farm workers? That's going to be B. Cesar Chavez. There was much opposition to the Vietnam War in the United States. Reasons for this opposition include all the following except... Okay, let's look at the choices. B. The United States was interfering what was essentially a civil war. That's true. C. U.S. bombing raids killed innocent Vietnamese civilians. True. D. The draft unfairly targeted poor and working class men. That's true. So looking at A. U.S. soldiers were not trained and equipped to fight in the jungle. That's not one of the reasons for the opposition. So there we go. All of the following describe changes in the role of women and the structure of the family that occurred in the late 20th century, except for A. The size of the average family increased dramatically due to women working outside the home. And lastly, all the following describe Richard Nixon's foreign and domestic achievements as president, except for this is a tough one because I'm not really sure. They all seem to be his achievements. We'll put ending Vietnam. Ah, there we go. He helped lead to the end of it. I guess they're just not saying he ended it. Okay. So there's your word to write down. That's the one you might need for the end of the lesson. Okay, let's read through the highlights for the unit review. The construction of the Berlin Wall. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 symbolized the line of demarcation between communism and democracy. The rise of Fidel Castro and his communist regime in Cuba brought Soviet power and the threat of nuclear missiles to the Caribbean. The Bay of Pigs incident led Khrushchev to believe Kennedy was weak, but Kennedy responded forcefully and carefully to the Soviets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the Far East, communism threatened Vietnam, a former French colony that was divided into two countries. The domino theory led Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy to support South Vietnamese dictator Ngo Diem with U.S. aid against North Vietnamese communist leader Ho Chi Minh. President Lyndon Johnson escalated the war in 1964 when Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, allowing him to send troops without a formal declaration of war. President Johnson appointed General William Westmoreland commander of American forces and began air attacks on Operation Rolling Thunder in an attempt to destroy the North Vietnamese supply system along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In Vietnam, guerrilla warfare in a jungle environment posed difficulties for the United States. The United States used new weapons like napalm and Agent Orange. At home, Americans questioned the war with marches, demonstrations, and debates between hawks and doves. Using the draft to build the military led to questions about class, fairness, and political power. Although the Tet Offensive resulted in a military victory for South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese had proved their ability to strike anywhere in South Vietnam. President Nixon called for Vietnamization of forces and the bombing of Cambodia to interrupt supply lines. National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State Henry Kissinger negotiated a peace that was formalized with an agreement in 1973. Despite a truce, the North Vietnamese took Saigon in 1975, forced the evacuation of remaining U.S. advisors and troops, and united the country under Ho Chi Minh's communist rule. The 1960s were a time of student movements to protest the war, promote peace, oppose the draft, challenge racism, address poverty, and question the rule of authority in government. Student organizations included Students for a Democratic Society, the Free Speech Movement, and Young Americans for Freedom, a less formal culture also developed. Woodstock became a symbol for our generation, and Bob Dylan became the voice of hippies and others advocating cultural freedom and change. Violent political protests, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, and Richard Nixon's appeal to what he called the silent majority marked the social and political upheaval and public fatigue of 1968. A second wave in the women's movement began with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique and the founding of the National Organization of Women, NOW, which led to congressional passage, but not ratification, of the Equal Rights Amendment. Title IX guaranteed women opportunities in school sports. The landmark decision in Roe v. Wade sparked an ongoing moral and political debate over abortion. Inspired by the civil rights movement, previously silent groups, including gays and lesbians, Native Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and the elderly, voiced their demands for equal rights and protections. Cesar Chavez led a nonviolent fight for Mexican American farm workers and founded the American Farm Workers Union. By 1968, Americans were weary of the Vietnam War and a battered social order at home, and elected Republican Richard M. Nixon president on his promises of law and order and states' rights. Nixon proved to be a moderate on domestic issues, strengthening some of Johnson's Great Society programs, creating the Environmental Protection Agency, and using affirmative action to address problems of racial discrimination in employment. Nixon's attempts to end the war in Vietnam resulted in a tentative peace agreement in 1972, but the war continued. Nixon worked to ease Cold War tensions with Communist China. The United States and the Soviet Union pursued a policy of détente, efforts to ease tensions, establish better relations, and reduce the chances of a nuclear war. Newspaper reporters, a congressional investigation, and federal prosecutors revealed abuses of power by Nixon and high-ranking White House officials in a scandal known as Watergate. The Watergate scandal led to Richard Nixon's resignation and shook Americans' faith in their government. Gerald Ford's administration was plagued by stagflation and rising prices and declining employment. The war in Vietnam ended in 1975 when North Vietnamese troops captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. President Jimmy Carter tried to establish an informal, accessible tone for his presidency. President Carter's major achievement was brokering the peace talks between Egypt and Israel that resulted in the Camp David Accords. In 1979, Iranian revolutionaries broke into the American embassy in Tehran and took more than 60 Americans hostage, keeping them for over a year and weakening Carter's presidency. And that's where we'll end today. Don't forget to go to the 5.13 checkpoint and answer the questions there. And good luck on your Unit 5 test. Be sure that you go through your reading guides. Make sure that you've done the lesson readings. Go through any lesson quizzes that you've taken in Unit 5. Be sure that you're familiar with the review activities from this lesson, 5.13, and you are prepared and ready to take the test. Best of luck to you.